Welcome back to When Bad Things Happen to Good People, a podcast about censorship and the arts. My name's Todd Sullivan. Joining me as always is Peter Rahman.
Hello, hello.
And today we are beginning our look at Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr.
Or The Children's Crusade.
A Duty Dance with Death.
That's right.
Well,
this is, we were discussing a little bit before we started about non-linear books and how it's a bit of a challenge sometimes to, kind of order everything in your brain when you're getting the information out of order. So, there's a challenge to this book around that. We'll get into that in due course, but maybe why don't you walk us through where and why it was banned?
Sure. Let me just see what... okay, so we have banned book Slaughterhouse-Five from politics-prose.com. Kurt Vonnegut's World War II classic was variously challenged, banned, and burned across the United States from 1972 onward, and most recently in 2007. I don't know when this article was written, so maybe it was banned more recently than that, but... The book was banned in Levittown, New York in 1975, North Jackson, Ohio in 1979, and Lakeland, Florida in 1982 for its explicit sexual scenes, violence, and obscene language. Slaughterhouse-Five was challenged as recently as 2007 in a school district in Howell, Michigan, because the book contained strong sexual content. Upon reviewing the book, the country prosecutor concluded, after reading the book in question, it is clear that the explicit passages illustrated a larger literary, artistic, or political message and were not included solely to appeal to the prurient interests of minors. Which, I mean, yeah.
That's fair, right?
And we have, I found an article that had some of Vonnegut's thoughts on being banned. In 1973, in an interview with Library Journal, Vonnegut said, "It's the same thing every time. They ban something of mine, the ACLU jumps in, loses the case in the lower court, and wins the appeal. After all, they can't win. What they're doing is unconstitutional." When Slaughterhouse-Five was burned in North Dakota in 1973, Vonnegut responded with a letter to the school board president, defending the novel as not sexy and do not argue in favor of wildness of any kind. In terms of the language, he argued, "It is true that some of the characters speak coarsely. That is because people speak coarsely in real life. Especially soldiers and hardworking men speak coarsely, and even our most sheltered children know that. And we all know, too, that those words really don't damage children much. They didn't damage us when we were young. It was evil deeds and lying that hurt us."
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's not surprising to me that Vonnegut would be or would have been troubled by, his books being banned. There's nothing in my mind remotely hateful, negative, anything that would cause, other than, the specifics of, they said some bad words. Billy Pilgrim had sex.
Yeah,
And there's a sex scene in this first 100 pages that is one of the least sexy things I have ever read.
I mean,
when he makes love to his wife after their wedding, it's like a paragraph long. It was just like, okay,
yeah, it's pretty awkward, right? It is not sexy. It is not titillating in any way, right? And really, the bulk of the book, right? He definitely argued it right in the sense that it's not there to be salacious, right?
No.
It's to present a real view of how people kind of experience the war and how people really talk to each other and that kind of thing. And yeah, to ban something because of that is pretty big overreach, I think, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. But it, definitely, there's some stuff in there, but, in terms of some of the things that we've looked at on this podcast or that are out there, that are potentially still in schools and things like that, I don't, like it's kind of tame in a sense.
Yeah.
Right?
And I mean, I don't remember the book that well to know whether or not things get a whole lot worse in the second half, but from the things they pointed out, the language and the sex, and I can't imagine it getting any worse than we've already seen.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, we know there's the firing squad sequence that's going to
been heavily foreshadowed.
Yeah, right. So we know that's coming up, but yeah, I mean, I think you have to encompass some grit and some imagery that is maybe not all roses and sunshine when you're talking about war. I mean,
I don't know how you could discuss war.
The point of it is to get at some of the horror
Yeah.
around that experience, right? And how terrible it is to be part of and to witness it and that kind of thing, right? So to dance around that or to shy away or cloud it in some way, I think would really be a disservice to the story, right?
Yeah.
So, that makes sense. And, when you read it, you don't really, you don't get an impression that there's stuff thrown in just for the sake of it, or that, this is here as a exclamation point or to be salacious or tittillating or anything like that, right? I mean, it's very, all the interactions between the characters are very realistic, right? Even some of the inner thoughts of Billy, even though his mind wanders and that kind of thing, right? Like, they're still very realistic, in terms of how someone, in that character, would kind of process things. So, I think it would be a real disservice to the story if there were just sunshines and rainbows, or, we gloss over the fact, or the language is super clean or something like that. That's not how soldiers talk.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting that, a lot of the book in general, but you particularly notice in the parts about the war, it almost feels very mundane in the way that he's describing it, but that's also the way he describes kind of everything else. And in a way, it's sort of that the banality of evil kind of concept that, as much as there were these huge, violent conflicts and everything else, there's also the minutia moments in war where it's just guys trudging in bad shoes, hoping to stay alive for one more day.
Yeah.
I honestly took no notes on this.
Okay.
I didn't even know how we were going to approach talking about this because of the way it ping pongs through time so much.
I took a lot of notes.
I see that.
They're very, very plot, they're plot centric, I guess, but really, because it's such a fluid, non-linear book, it's difficult. I'm just kind of trying to describe to myself in my notes kind of where things are going back and forth, right? Okay, he slipped through time, or here, or, he flashed back to this or that. And honestly, it's been a while. So, as we talked about, I think in the live episode, I did read this on November 11th.
Yeah.
Or the bulk of it, the first 4
and
chapters.
It's now December 3rd when we're recording.
Yeah, so it's been a little while.
It's had time to get hazy. I, on the other hand, just finished chapter 5 an hour ago or so. So
okay, so
it's a little fresher in my mind.
Yeah, it's fresh in your mind, and for me, I'll be referring back to my notes.
Well, since you have notes, I'm thinking maybe we let you guide us along, and I will share my thoughts as we come along. But I would like to start by saying this is really a non-traditionally plotted book, to the extent that the first chapter isn't even really the first chapter of the book itself.
Yeah, it's kind of essentially a preamble, or like almost an author's introduction.
That's what I think a lot of authors would have treated it that way, as like a prelude or a foreword or something like that. But because of the fact that Vonnegut does refer to himself in the novel periodically as well
as one of the characters,
as somebody who is there at the place where Billy Pilgrim ends up. It does kind of work as the first chapter.
Yes.
But the first chapter is very much about Vonnegut talking about his struggles to try to write what he at that time called his Dresden novel, which became Slaughterhouse-Five.
Yeah.
And there was, I think the one anecdote that stood out to me from that chapter is when he went to visit a friend of his who had also been in the war, drink whiskey, talk with his friend, and try to reminisce and hit on some some memories about what they had experienced together.
Yeah.
And the man's wife became increasingly angry over the course of this conversation they were having.
Yes. But I mean, he does describe that the reason for her anger was because she thought the war book that he was, purporting to write would be something that would glorify war, or that would, be something that would, maybe popularize war, or, give it some bravado or something like that, which he then disillusions her to, right, by describing what he's actually trying to write. And then she's kind of on board with it.
Yeah. And in her defense, I mean, that has traditionally been, at least at that time, the way war stories were told. They're almost propaganda. It's almost saying like, rah, rah, we are the good guys and they were the bad guys. This was a just fight and it was God's will. And that's not the kind of story that Vonnegut was trying to tell.
Shout out to your other podcast, Half Cut Conspiracy Theories, where you guys did a look at U.S. military spending on books and movies and things like that.
Yeah, that was a fun episode.
Yeah, about propaganda, right?
Propaganda.
But yeah, I mean, even at that time, in the 70s, where that kind of thing was happening, where there was money for that and that kind of thing. Yeah, we kind of get her, anger at another war book, or at least bringing her family into it. But
she reminded him, I say reminded him because it felt like he had the sense when he was writing about that part of the book, but like that essentially wars are fought by children. Like the men who go to war are so insanely young that they might as well still be children.
Yeah,
they're confused, they're scared.
Billy Pilgrim, is a example of that, right? I mean, was he 17 or 18? I think.
I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Like he's essentially basically too young, or right on the cusp, right, of being even old enough to be accepted into the military, and off to war, right? Like it's, I think World War II, when we look at from a historical perspective, there's lots and lots of cases of that, children who were younger than 18, right, who were too young to fight, but fake their or what have you, right? And it really stands out as we see in a later chapter where there's an officer there who's kind of quite old, and he volunteered or something like that, but he's like 20 years older than kind of the next next oldest kid in his unit or something like that, right? And he just stands out like a sore thumb, this kind of older character. But yeah, I mean, for me, learning a little bit about the Children's Crusade, right, which is that kind of comparative, a kind of historical thing where they were conscripting actual kids, to fight wars, and seeing that there's not really much difference, right, in whether it's World War II or other wars, that it's mainly the young that are going out to fight, right?
And I guess from a certain perspective, you could argue that they're the easiest to replace.
I guess. I mean, that's a sad and depressing
I know,
thought,
right? But like, that's got to be a portion of what's going through the minds of the military leaders as they make these decisions about sending these. They don't have, no one's invested too much into skills or for these people, so if they get erased, then we can just pump out another generation batch, of them or something,
train up another batch of kids. And
it sounds like something from Brave New World almost.
Yeah, like kind of. Yeah.
Anyway.
We'll just grow another Volkanovsky group.
Exactly.
Send them out. Yeah.
Is there anything else from the first chapter that you want to touch on? Because that was really sort of the only thing that I had.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing around that meeting with his friend that stood out to me as well, because he introduces that he's been struggling with this and he's trying to write it and, humming and hawing. It establishes that he is an author, that he's written other books, but he's working on this, quote unquote Dresden novel that he's been trying to write since returning from the war. But when he gets together with his friend finally to sit down, right? So the wife is angry and everything. He tells her what the book's really about. She's kind of on board. And then when they actually get to reminiscing about the war and trying to kind of find these, nuggets that he can use for the book, they don't find anything.
Yeah.
Right. Like they're really unable still. And this is, years past the war. They're still unable to really process, some of the horror and some of the, the stuff that really affected them. And I thought that was an interesting kind of thing. Because when we get into the book, I mean, obviously the book is written about Billy Pilgrim, right? It's not written about the author's real experience, right? Although he does pop up a little bit in the book, but it's written about another character.
But it does make you wonder, or at least it made me wonder, if there was overlap. Like how much of what Billy Pilgrim experienced was similar to what Vonnegut experienced. It could very well be none of it. It could very well be some of it. Like I'm sure he's, was very capable of imagining things, but it could also be like stories he heard from other people. I mean, I would be probably more than any other book I've ever read. It would be interesting to see like earlier drafts of this to see how it progressed. Because I imagine it must have started as a more traditional narrative of like beginning, middle, and end.
And then started to
And it would be interesting to see
later,
at what point the whole moving around in time thing began. Because that's the core kind of conceit of the novel. The first line of chapter 2, which is really the start of the book,
that's right,
is listen, Billy Pilgrim has become unstuck in time.
Yes.
And
that listen kind of imperative structure comes up a few times in the book.
Yeah.
As well as what's the other saying? Anytime there's a talk about death.
Yeah.
And not just human death, like it extends into animals and things.
Yeah.
Right? There's so it goes.
But then you need to explain why that is too.
Yeah, which I don't know if I have a good note around that, because there's a little anecdote in the book about why.
Yeah.
Someone that he knew.
No, it's from the Tralfamadorians.
Oh, right. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
So,
yes. From the time. Yeah.
So I don't know. Do we want to talk about that now, or wait till the Tralfamadorians come up?
Yeah. Maybe we'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
But yes. So there's a few things that kind of repeat in the book that I think help tie that disjointed timeline together a little bit. Right. Okay. The so it goes and the listen and that kind of stuff. Right. Where it kind of holds the book together a little bit, because yes, it does jump around a lot and can be a little hard to follow.
Yeah, because essentially what happens is Billy Pilgrim begins sort of bouncing around through his life, bouncing around in time. So at one moment he's in World War II. He closes his eyes. He opens his eyes, and he's is
like
44 years old.
Yeah, he's back at work.
He's an optometrist.
Or he's on his honeymoon with his wife.
He's on his honeymoon with his wife, or he's on an alien planet called Tralfamadore with a bunch of aliens that look like hands on top of toilet plungers.
Yes.
And at any moment, you don't know where he's going to go,
or how long he's going to be,
or how long he's going
moment.
to be there. Yeah.
Because sometimes he'll jump to one moment and then he'll jump back to the war.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, kind of the primary line that we're following is kind of more the war line, and we're kind of jumping around from there. But he'll jump from the war to a certain kind of time in his life, jump back into his life at another point, jump back, and then kind of maybe he goes to Tralfamadore, right? Like he's experiencing a lot of stuff while being in the same kind of moment back in the war, right? The back in the war is kind of where he defaults to a lot, right?
And I took a lot of that, actually. It reminded me of, when you're just doing something on any given day, and you have an aroma or a sound that reminds you of a memory.
So a strong reminiscence.
And you're suddenly kind of back there for a couple of minutes, and then someone's like, hello, and you snap back to where you are.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of those moments that in the book, that's sort of what they felt like to me. Like him, there's a very brief scene when he's checking someone's eyes with the optometry machine that was described as an upside down owl, which I immediately knew what he was talking about, because I plugged my face into those things so many times.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, he just sort of wakes up and sort of continues the eye exam before snapping back to the war again. But that very much felt like that moment of like, I've just reminisced to something and I'm kind of out of where I am right now. And it takes me a second to kind of refocus.
Yeah. And I think there's a few situations or circumstances where, something is happening that he may not want to witness or be part of, and then he travels, backwards or forwards or however kind of, he's going. And that takes him out of maybe a little bit, unpleasant situation or something like that. Right. So, not that he seems to be in control of it or anything like that. It just seems to kind of happen. But certainly, kind of, an interesting, kind of like, just, we don't know what sets him off is the thing, right? Like we see it happen, but there doesn't appear to be any specific thing like it's triggered by this or triggered by that. And sometimes he stays longer.
At certain points,
right?
it feels like it's almost implied that he's always lived his life this way. Like,
maybe not always. I think there's a point where he says it happened. Yeah. Right when he was younger, but
I don't remember there ever being a point where he said this was the first time it happened.
Yeah,
but not that it matters.
I'm trying to remember, but I feel like the first part was either during basic training or when he actually goes to the war.
Could be,
but I mean, he's 17 or 18, right? So fairly early days in his life, and at that point.
Either way, it feels very much like how the past can
creep up on
you, weigh on you at distant points in the future as well.
Yeah, with I guess the other component being that a lot of times it's the future, right? In kind of his war experience, he's flashing forward in time quite a bit, right?
Fair enough.
Obviously, he's quite young in the war, so the majority of the flashes you would think would be forward in time rather than to his childhood. But
we do get a couple of childhood ones as well. We have a moment in the belly. All like warm and bubbly and
warm and cozy, and before he's out into the world. Yeah. Okay.
So let's take us through what you have for chapter 2.
Yeah. So for chapter 2, so it starts with the listen. Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. The chapter starts out with kind of a little bit of his life in Ilium, New York, is where he grew up. So at this point, it's more just kind of talking about stuff that's happened in his life. So kind of the milestones, right? He went to war, he came back, he was in optometry school, and he went to war, came back, finished the optometry school. I'm not sure if it talked specifically about, I don't have in my notes here, but he did have a nervous breakdown or panic attack or kind of thing in the middle of finishing optometry school, but he did come back and finish it. He gets married, so the daughter of the optometry practice owner has a fancy or liking to Billy. He marries her, and that's part of how he takes over this booming practice,
optometry business,
right? This booming, with like 5 offices and
money's in the frames,
and he invests in other businesses. He has 2 kids, so he has
he ends up setting up one of his own kids into optometry as well, doesn't he?
I don't think so.
I got that.
No, his son is like.
One of his sons went into the Green Berets.
Yeah, he's a Green Beret, and then his daughter.
One son, one daughter.
I think I don't have notes here, but I think she went into medicine potentially, but not optometry. She helped out at the office at some point.
That could be.
Yeah. So he almost dies in a plane crash.
Right. What a weird.
Yeah, just kind of.
And that never comes
thing.
up again yet. Well, maybe it came up.
It came up in the sense that there was a bit about when he was in the hospital recovering from that. But yeah, so he's
just being on a plane, crashes into the mountains. He's the only one that survives.
Yeah, only survivor, right? Goes, and he's recovering for a long time. And during that time, his wife dies.
Right.
Right. So, the family, but he's not there because he's in recovery I think it's in Canada or something, right?
I don't remember.
I think it was flying from Montreal or something. And so he's recovering in like a Canadian hospital and can't, travel. And when he finally comes back, that's where he decides to tell people about what he's been experiencing in his life, about being, unstuck in time, about his, abduction by the aliens and all this kind of stuff. Right. It tells us a little bit about, how he got into the war. So he started in the Army as a chaplain's assistant.
Yeah.
Right. He was basically doing training, and something happened to another chaplain's assistant, and so he was like called up, from the miners essentially to fill in. But it was that unit that he was supposed to take over for his chaplain's assistant. They ended up being at the Battle of the Bulge, and so he was like thrown into this massive battle. And I think by the time he shows up,
there's like a handful of them. Yeah, there's like almost nobody left.
But when he shows up, the chaplain has already been killed. I think, right? So he shows up. He's not, doesn't even have boots or anything. Like, he shows up still dressed as a civilian.
Civilian shoes,
right? And his chaplain has been killed. He doesn't know what's going on, and he's super young, and he just kind of gets thrown into this huge battle. And he survives, but he ends up trapped behind enemy lines with 3 other soldiers. So 2 are kind of these, scouts that we don't, mysterious scouts that we don't really know too much about. And the other one is this kind of chubby, like, really kind of braggy, like weird dude called Roland Weary, who kind of has all the conversation.
He fancies himself a bit of a war hero, Roland Weary does, and he starts imagining this, like, he and the 2 scouts, being kind of a crusading group. He thinks of them as the 3 musketeers.
Yeah, even though I don't think he's ever talked to the scouts, right? Like, he's just a weird character.
Yeah.
So the first time, so in this chapter, and we don't know, I guess, if it's the first time or not, but at one point, they're in the woods. Billy comes unstuck. He sees his mother in like an old folks home. And then we flashes to a party where he's drunk and kind of like, I think either hits on or, does something with
he brings a woman to a back room or a laundry room or
a cloakroom or something like that. And then Weary snaps him out of that. The scouts ditch Billy and Roland.
He advises them to go and like surrender to the nearest Germans they can find.
Billy has kind of a bit of a fantasy of like dancing in a ballroom, and then that kind of
wasn't he skating? He was skating in like white baseball socks, basically, on the slippery floor of the ballroom.
Floor, and that kind of just bleeds into an actual kind of memory or forward flash in time where he's giving a speech at the Lions Club because he's just been elected the new president.
Right.
And he doesn't really know what's going on, but he's surprised at kind of like how eloquent he is and that he's actually able to speak in front of people. And then Weary attacks Billy Pilgrim because he's just angry at Billy. Well, not angry at Billy, but angry that the scouts left and that his 3 musketeers are broken
well, and
up.
part of it, I think the reason they left is because Billy has not been...
He's been super
unfocused.
Been
slow. Yeah. He's walking funny because he's lost the heel of one of his shoes.
So he bobs up and down.
He's constantly going like, "Leave me behind, guys. Just go on without me.
Just let me die."
And I think like Weary was not, was, I guess, in his mind enough of a hero to not let Billy Pilgrim be left behind, but the scouts weren't. The scouts were just like, "We're fucking off."
Yeah.
And I think
also Roland was, not at their level either, right?
True, but I do think he could have at least tried to keep up with them and abandoned Pilgrim if he wanted to.
Yeah.
But then because he didn't, I think there's a certain amount of anger towards Billy.
Yeah.
That it was because of him that they got left behind.
Yeah.
But then right around this time, the Germans find them.
Yeah. I mean, Roland takes no blame, I guess. For
no, he never does.
Yeah. So he transfers all of that anger to Billy.
Yeah.
They get into a bit of a brawl, really. Like, well, I mean, Billy's not really fighting back or anything. No. Roland's just kind of, trying to kill him essentially. And then
Germans
look down on them are kind of like,
the fuck you guys doing?
They're almost like just like mouths open, like what the hell are these Americans doing? Like they don't even understand it, right?
Yeah.
And like Billy's dressed as a civilian, so it looks like there's a fat soldier
and this soldier is decked out head to toe. Like, he describes a long paragraph describing every single thing he's wearing. It's like wool pants, wool overpants, wool underpants, this, like everything.
Yeah, he's well equipped. Got all sorts of, he's got a special triangular knife and all sorts of stuff. And Billy,
why do you have that special triangular knife?
Yeah, because it
wound
creates a
doesn't
wound.
close.
Yeah, it won't close.
If it's a thin knife, it just leaves a slit. That'll close. But a triangle, no, that won't close.
Can't do that. No, that's a.
And you got to have a knife with blood gutters too.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, Billy, I mean, he's dressed like, he's got like a regular trench coat or something like that. Like, he does not look anything
he ends
like
up getting
a
a trench coat from the Germans that's like 3 sizes too small for him. Like,
that's later
the
on.
The waist is like up under his armpits.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, he also doesn't look like a soldier because, whether he was traveling or however long it took him to get over there. I mean, he doesn't have the buzz cut, he's got a beard and, like lots of facial hair and like not a traditional soldier's look. Yeah. So, these German soldiers that find them are like, why is this soldier like beating up this weird American civilian,
this
right?
Scrawny
like,
little civilian.
They don't understand what the hell's going on. But the good thing, I guess, is they capture them rather than putting them out of their misery right there, right? So, they get taken prisoner, and now they're getting marched off to wherever they're going to keep these prisoners. And Billy continues to float through time.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So let's see here. We're into chapter 3 now. So this is one where he goes, he shifts back to when he's with a patient in his office, right, and kind of goes through that upside down owl part. Then he gets, kind of comes back, snaps back to the war. And the Germans are doing kind of a propaganda type piece. So they get them to reenact the capture.
Oh, that's right. He's got to pretend to come out of the bushes.
Yeah, and like Billy's kind of doesn't really know what's going on, so he's coming out of the bushes like smiling and stuff, and the Germans are kind of like, why is this guy so happy to get captured? It doesn't make any sense. It's just kind of a weird thing. But yeah, the Germans shoot their little propaganda piece, and it flips back and forth here in time quite a bit where, he's driving his Cadillac, down the road, or he's back to the Lions Club lunch. Someone's talking to him about the Vietnam War at this Lions Club lunch and talking about his son, who's in the Green Berets. He goes home to nap after the lunch rather than going back to work. He flashes back to the war, and they're marched to a train yard where they're sorted onto different trains. And there's a dying colonel there that kind of fills Billy's head with a bit of nonsense about the war. Then they're loaded into rail cars. And while they're doing that, Billy sees like the guards' rail car, and it's all decked out with like, there's like a fireplace and, all this food and that kind of stuff, and just looks all super cozy and comfy. And they're just packed like sardines into this kind of car where, they got to toss the, like the bedpans and stuff. They got to hold them up to these slots up top, these ventilator slots, and that's how they got to dump their piss and shit out of the train. And so very, very different in terms of the train cars that the prisoners are on.
At one point on the train car, I remember Billy can't even find a place to sleep because no one will sleep next to him because he moans and kicks constantly.
Yeah, so we don't know if that's tied to his time
slipping through time or just the war.
Just war, night terrors, or whatever.
Maybe both.
So they don't let him sleep. He's got to essentially sleep standing up because no one will make room for them. And they tend to. It sounds like the soldiers on the car kind of created a bit of a schedule, right? Some would lay down and sleep, and others would stand, and so they would have room. But nobody wants to do that for Billy. They've all been kicked or
they've all done their time, and nobody wants to do it again.
Exactly. So we kind of see how it's working, and there's also a hobo in the train car, which they don't explain how he's there or why he's there, but he's not a soldier; he's just a hobo. And
I thought he was a former hobo who was a soldier. I could have taken that wrong.
Maybe I just remembered hobo, but he and
Billy
tend to they kind of team up a little bit.
He's interesting because he's just constant like I've had worse. I've been worse. Like I've been hungrier than
this. This isn't bad. Are you guys kidding me? This isn't bad. Yeah. And so they spend Christmas together. Apparently, they're snuggled up. They spend Christmas together, and I'm not sure if it's in this chapter, but the hobo does just kind of die.
At
some point,
again,
after
his last word was something like, "Yeah, it's not so bad."
Yeah, I've had worse, not so bad, and then he dies.
Yeah.
Right. Let's see what else happens. I think that's about it. At the end of the chapter, he time slips to when he is kidnapped by the creatures from Tralfamadore.
So let's talk about those guys a little bit. Mm-hmm. Right up until I got here, I was finding myself trying to figure out what they're bringing to the novel besides an excuse to put it on a science fiction shelf.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what it is, what I've landed on as we've been talking, is that it's a way of describing what Vonnegut is trying to explain is happening with his bouncing around in time.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, because the creatures have a different sense of time.
They exist they perceive time differently than we do.
Yeah,
they see all of time
from the start of time to the end of time.
They look at all of time as if it's a mountain range, essentially. So when they look at a person, they don't see like a person with a head and 2 arms and 2 legs. Mm-hmm. They're described as actually look like a person looks like this massively long caterpillar.
Yeah, of moments.
That with baby feet at the end and super old man feet at the other end. And they basically see all of that person's life as one single moment. Mm-hmm. And so when someone from Tralfamadore dies, there's not really any mourning. They don't see someone who's dead. They see, it's described as like a person who is particularly unwell at that particular moment in time. Yeah. But through all of these other moments in time,
they're fine.
Yeah. And so there's no sense in mourning in those moments, and so that's they're saying so it goes. Yeah. Because really, you're just dead in that moment.
That's right.
All those other moments are still living in those moments, and you are still alive.
That's right.
In those moments, and from their perspective, there really is no such thing as free will because there's no time they're moving through in order to make choices.
Yeah, when you can look at all of time as kind of one string. Then there isn't a free choice or anything like that, right? Because you can see the end of the string, even if you start looking at it at the middle or whatever. You can see all the way to the end of the string. There's no deviation, right? But I did think of it as a bit of an interesting device that Billy's experiencing this, and he just so happens to be abducted by aliens that can perfectly explain to him what's going on with his slipping through time and being able to see all these moments in his life, some that haven't happened yet or some that have already happened, and be able to move back and forth.
But again, that only haven't happened or has happened is all dependent on your reference in time.
That's right.
Which to the Tralfamadorians is non-existent.
Yeah, because it all has happened.
It all has happened. It's all happening at once.
That's right.
But I thought, when Billy asked them at one point, like, why me? They're like, oh, what a silly human.
Yeah, what a stupid human question.
Like, why anybody? Like, you know about like bugs in amber?
Yeah.
Why are they in amber? Just because.
That's just how it goes.
How it goes. This
just
is how
so
this
happened
is going.
that this was what happened during this moment. Yeah.
And it's interesting because that line is repeated, I think, either the same chapter or the next chapter in the war. When somebody else, I think Billy overhears it. He doesn't ask it, but somebody else in the middle of where they'd been captured or whatever is like, why me? I think he was just had his teeth punched out by somebody in a conflict. And he's like, why me? And the guy's, why not? Yeah. And it's that same thing. Like, why does anything happen? Mm-hmm. There's really no reason.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the central theme of like the banality of war and that kind of thing, right? Like why does it happen? Why are our children fighting? Why, it's, I think an interesting question where, it I think pushes people to go, well, is there a way for that to not happen? Right. Are there things we can do around this? Is there really some, free choice or is everything tied to fate? Certainly as far as the Tralfamadorians and Billy, they seem to be able to, look at things as there is no choice. It is a series of moments that stretch from here to eternity and back.
Yep.
And everything is fixed. But, asking that question or having that saying, and so it goes, or, why does it happen to anyone? It's just, you're there in that moment. I think, maybe prompts us to think about, are there ways where we can, avoid war or do things differently, right? But yeah, it's they're interesting creatures, and the fact that they kind of take Billy and put him in a zoo, or their version of a zoo kind of thing, to me that I think was a bit weird in the sense that, like they can kind of see all of time and that kind of thing, but maybe they have difficulty communicating it to each other. I mean, they communicate telepathically. So realistically, if one of them kind of observes something or meets someone and can see their entire life in a series of moments, you would think they'd kind of be able to communicate that, but they bring him back and put him in a zoo for people to come and observe.
If they didn't do that, though, they never would have been able to observe him in the zoo
in more of a
for that forever amount of time.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you still need to do the thing in order to experience the thing, even if you're experiencing it all at once.
They still need to get those moments there,
yeah,
rather than on Earth. Yeah.
And I like the description of the Tralfamadorian novels as well, where it's like there's like little bursts of information between breaks, and essentially it's meant to be read as all of these bursts of information being experienced at once.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like, have you seen those things? They take every frame of a movie and overlap it all into a single image so that you see every single frame in a movie at once. It's almost like trying to watch a movie like that.
Like instantaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how they experience everything, including their literature.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense with their kind of view of time, right?
And unfortunately, Billy only had one novel to read there that wasn't Tralfamadorian literature. It was The Valley of the Dolls, which I've not read.
Yeah. I haven't read it either, but an interesting choice because it's all about kind of drug use.
It's like drugged up Hollywood women or housewives, or
something like that. Like
yeah.
So an interesting read to have as you're isolated.
Your one single solitary book that you can read.
Yeah, and I mean, you got to think from a mental health perspective, being isolated on your own on an alien planet, and you're just reading about people doing drugs, and
you're going to be so sad that you don't have any drugs yourself to help get through that experience.
Exactly right. So. We get into chapter 4 here, I think. He is back in time. He's at his daughter's wedding. He knows he's going to be kidnapped after his daughter's wedding because he's been unstuck in time. So he puts on a war movie.
Then the war movie plays backwards for a while.
Yeah, and it's like people getting like bullets sucked out of them, and like just kind of a weird thing to watch. It kind of seemed like the way he was describing the movie seemed like could have been about Dresden, like there was firebombing and that kind of stuff happening. And then he kind of wanders outside, and he's just like waiting around to be abducted. The flying saucer kind of comes into play. What
I think is interesting there too is he talked about how like he's walking out into the yard, he's carrying a bottle of like it's no longer bubbly champagne. He knows the spaceship is coming down. He doesn't look up at it, and it's like, to an extent, that's partly because when it actually happened the first time or whatever, when he's bouncing through it, he doesn't actually know it's coming. So that's why he wouldn't be looking up. And then every other time he wouldn't be looking up then anyway, because it didn't happen that way. But at the same time, there's also no reason to. So it's
he knows it's going to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And this is, as you alluded to before, when he gets kind of beamed onto the ship, where he asks the why me question, and they go through that explanation. And then they do bring him back to their zoo. They apparently stole a lot of furniture from the Sears and Roebuck to furnish his
R.I.P. Sears.
Yeah, to furnish his enclosure in the zoo. So they loaded up their spaceship just with all this, furniture and TVs and stuff. And obviously the TV doesn't work when they get it back.
Right.
To the zoo.
There's a picture of a scene from a war movie on it.
Yeah. And so, he's observed, and he doesn't wear any clothes. So he's just kind of like naked, in the zoo, just kind of like walking around doing his thing, just completely naked. And yeah, he snaps back from that moment, and he's back on a train in the war. So the trains they were loaded into the rail cars, and then they were kind of like moved around as prisoners of war. One thing that we forgot to mention maybe was that the different kind of classes of soldiers. So officers were loaded into, and different classes of soldier were in different cars, and so they start to break off some of the other cars, and they're going to different prison camps and that kind of thing. And Billy's car is one of the last cars, to arrive at a final destination, right? He sees most of the other cars kind of get broken off from the main train. And then, okay, so this is where the hobo dies. And Roland Weary also dies. He's not in the same car as Billy, but we get a little note about Roland dying. And he has told everyone in his car that the person who killed him is Billy Pilgrim, and has made them swear to get revenge for Roland's death, on revenge him against Billy Pilgrim,
the last standing member of the Three Musketeers. Because the other two scouts, we find out, were gunned down.
Yeah. I think, I'm not sure if maybe Roland or Billy were aware of it, but it's during their kind of capture. There's gunshots.
Yeah, there are gunshots, and
we know it's the scouts. But
the narrator tells us, Vonnegut tells us that it's the scouts. They had been,
but Roland and Billy probably unaware.
Don't know.
Yeah, they think they maybe got away, but they did not. And ultimately, I think part of that, I don't know if in the narration it's clear or not, but part of it is that their fighting was so shocking and weird to the Germans that's kind of why they got captured instead of shot on the spot kind of thing as well, right? Okay, so the train arrives to whichever prison. I don't think they name the prison, and so they're kind of unloaded, which is a bit of a slow process as they've been cooped up in there the whole time. And then this is where Billy gets the very funny jacket. So they're unloaded off the train. They're going to be in this kind of prison camp, and it's winter, so it's cold out. And there's a pile of jackets that they're marched to when they get off the train. And these are jackets of other dead soldiers, so they no longer need the jackets. Soldiers that presumably died in the prison camp, and they're told to kind of pick through there and pick out a jacket that fits. And so most of the soldiers have no problem doing that. And when Billy comes up and it's his turn, they kind of break off the jackets. They're all frozen in a pile, right? So the soldiers kind of break one off, and it's kind of like, basically you get what you get. So they break one off for Billy, and it is tiny, as Todd, you mentioned before, it's this tiny little jacket for, maybe it was a child or a very small
they talked
man.
about how the it was supposed to flare at the hips, but it actually flares like right underneath his armpits.
Yeah, it's like tiny. So I mean, he's already not dressed as a soldier, and now he has this comical jacket. So he's really just kind of this joke of a man to the German guards, which kind of I think maybe works in his favor. So then we meet or we see that they get shacked up with these British officers who are essentially very well apportioned in the camp. There was some kind of clerical error, so they were getting these
500 like boxes of supplies rather than 50 every week or every month or whatever it was,
and they just stockpiled it all away. And so they're actually they're kind of like feeding some of this stuff to the guards, right? They're doling it out, and they've got
and they're getting pretty well treated by the Germans in exchange.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and their officers as well.
Yeah.
So I think the Germans appreciate being able to talk to officers rather than kind of.
But don't pretend that all the tobacco and chocolate and coffee isn't helping.
Yeah.
And the Germans are nice enough to give them soap made out of the rendered fat of Jews and.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if they mention that directly to the English officers or
no. It just gets mentioned in the narrative of the book. Yeah, I don't think.
But yeah, so I mean, they're doing quite well for themselves, and the Americans kind of come into this, and so they've been cooped up in this rail car for a long time, and all of a sudden they're treated to this welcome feast, and it's just this largesse that they haven't really seen for a long time, or maybe ever in their lives, when they roll up into the English prison house. However, the British are they're very welcoming, but at the same time, they kind of look down on the American, infantrymen or, kind of the grunts that are shacked up with them, because it's pretty much the, kind of privates and not no officers or anything like that in Billy's car. And so they're kind of like not super happy with how the Americans behave themselves or talk or that kind of thing. These are classy English officers, right? So yeah, they're not super happy.
We've got Jerry on the run.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so yeah, they're welcome, but they're also kind of not welcome at the same time. But they have this nice feast, and yeah,
Billy has a bit of a breakdown and wakes up in the middle of a performance of Cinderella.
Yes. Is that in chapter 4 or is that kind of in
I don't
chapter
know.
5?
I don't have any notes. So. I seem to recall it was after the feast. Like, it's one of the first things that happens after he's picked up by the British, I think.
Okay.
He kind of blacks out during the food and wakes up in the middle of the Cinderella because he's aware that he's been watching it for a while because he's laughing.
Okay.
And then he starts kind of screaming. And so they take him off into the med bay and lock him up with some morphine.
Yeah. So the Cinderella is a play that the soldiers put on.
Yeah.
The British soldiers put on, and that's where he has this kind of breakdown.
Yeah.
And gets removed. Yeah, and put on morphine. Yeah. So there's a little bit about what you're talking about before, the Tralfamadorians. They are like spaghetti, and humans are like millipedes. Is kind of how they describe that view of time.
I think the spaghetti was describing the stars. When they look up at the stars, they don't see individual points of light.
Yeah, sorry, stars are like spaghetti. Yes,
they see because what they see is how the stars are all moving. So it's like everywhere they've been in the sky ever is what they see, and so it's all this like spaghetti in the sky.
Of spaghetti. Yes. Yeah. So he has a flash to when he's age 12 visiting the Grand Canyon. He gets so scared of looking into the canyon that he pees himself.
When his mom touches his shoulder, yeah.
Yeah, and then they flash 10 days ahead of that, and he's in the Carlsbad Caves in total darkness. And again, also, kind of very scared of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then he flashes back where he was being deloused and kind of recording names and kind of getting welcomed into the camp. And then after their big welcome supper, that's where they put on the Cinderella, and Billy kind of freaks out. So he gets on the morphine. He dreams he's a giraffe for some reason, and then goes into another time slip where he is at the Veterans Hospital, and he's kind of going a bit crazy. Doesn't want to talk to anyone. When his mother shows up, he kind of hides under a blanket the entire time.
Believe me, I've had those days.
Yeah, and he meets his neighbor to the right or left of him is this fellow named Elliot
Rosewater.
Yeah, and so
who appears in a few other Vonnegut things.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he introduces Billy to the author Kilgore Trout,
who also appears in some other Vonnegut things.
Oh, okay, yeah. And yeah, Kilgore has a bunch of B-level science fiction.
Yeah,
books.
He's a big part in Breakfast of Champions, which is my favorite Vonnegut novel. And I think I can't remember. There's a science fiction author whose last name is like a fish. And I think that's who Vonnegut
kind of
was.
A bit of a parody.
I don't know if it was a parody or just I'm taking inspiration from the name or what, yeah. But it was definitely a connection there.
Kilgore Trout, though. Very interesting.
Yeah, good name.
Yeah.
Not a very good writer, apparently.
Yeah. He's, his roommate in the hospital has kind of all these books.
Yeah, Rosewater is like, the prose is shit, but his ideas are good.
Yeah, exactly.
Only the ideas.
Yeah. But he has like the whole collection, and
Yeah.
there's maybe not that many in print to be found. But
There was like
got them
Maniacs in the Fourth Dimension,
Yeah.
which was about people who were crazy, but only because of things that were happening to them in the fourth dimension.
That's right.
So the psychiatrists in the third dimension couldn't cure them.
That's right. Well, and that's another thing with the Tralfamadorians, that how they educate Billy on that humans actually do exist in other dimensions.
Right, because the Tralfamadorians, there's 5 different people involved in making
procreating.
yeah.
Yeah,
And on Earth, there's actually 7.
that's right. It takes 7 people to make a baby,
But 5 of those people are involved in the fourth dimension.
or other dimensions,
Or other
I think.
dimensions, yeah.
like non.
And it was stuff like, babies can't be born unless there are gay people, like male homosexuals. Female homosexuals aren't involved. And then there's also elderly people.
Yeah,
and
but
babies
in
who
different dimensions.
Yeah,
they have
but
to
it's
be
like-
involved.
But they can't explain it because we don't understand those other dimensions, those
That's
higher
right.
dimensions. So, but they just have to be there. They're involved somehow.
Yeah, they're part of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they're doing something in another dimension to help make it work.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that, and there's other genders or something like that exist only in other dimensions, and yeah, very interesting other little point there from
The amount of things that we could have in other dimensions that we wouldn't know about is a little bit bonkers to think about. You know, could have entirely different sex organs in the fourth dimension.
That's right.
I could
and
be-
you may need them.
I could be having sex in the fourth dimension right now, and I wouldn't even know it.
That's right. But you may need them to procreate.
I might.
Yeah. Billy's mother comes and visits him in this hospital. And so this is, I think this is his hospital stay after his kind of mental break, because this is not the hospital stay when he was recovering from the plane crash.
No, this is mental break. Yeah.
Because his mother comes and is talking to him about his fiancée, Valencia, who is the daughter of the kind of main optometrist in Ilium, New York. And this is where we find out that Valencia is quite a large woman. She's... okay, what else? So she ends up, because Billy is hiding under the blanket, she talks to Elliot Rosewater a little bit, who is more than happy to, entertain her with conversation. Talks to her about some of the books that Kilgore has written. And we find out that nobody really knows where Kilgore Trout is. Then Valencia comes in to talk about their upcoming wedding, and Billy's just very detached, right? He's not really into it, and so he travels back to the zoo on Tralfamadore, where we discover that the Tralfamadorians have captured a mate for him.
A movie star.
Yeah, a movie star, and she's got an interesting name, and for whatever reason I didn't put it down here in my notes, but she's a movie star from Earth, and he's very good with her, right? Because they're both just kind of naked and put together in this zoo, and they're away from Earth, but he is very protective, of her, and doesn't kind of do anything until she's kind of ready to have a relationship or to talk to him or that kind of thing, right? And then we see some of the crowd that visits in the zoo, and one of the questions that they ask Billy, because they're able to interact with Billy by using a special kind of translating device, and the creatures ask him, "Are you happy here?" And he answers, "I'm about as happy as I was on Earth."
Right.
Which is, he says is kind of the true answer. This is also the chapter where we flash to his honeymoon with Valencia.
Yeah.
Right. So there's kind of the sex scene, which is, not really.
I'm trying to find that because I wanted to read it.
Okay. Yeah. So it's in chapter 5, looks like probably about halfway through. So, and again, it's not a very long section.
No, it's not. I'm right in the middle of him sort of bouncing around between the Tralfamadorians and being back on Earth.
But we do get a sense that Valencia understands that because she's maybe a bit of a larger woman, or doesn't have the greatest personality, that she's very she's very happy that Billy has agreed to marry her.
Yes.
Right. And she is kind of curious why, maybe a little bit. And, Billy just seems to have a very kind of lackadaisical attitude. He's kind of like, yeah, I mean, like, I love you. And, he's not really one way or the other, concerned with, her looks or,
because at one point
after
after they have sex, I think she says that she's going to try to lose weight for him. And he says, like, it's fine. I love you as you are. And she's like, really? And he has this moment where he's like, he doesn't say this, but he reflects on how he already knows how their entire marriage is going to go.
Yeah.
And it's basically, he says, like, it's not bad. It's good enough.
Yeah.
So, like, who cares? Like, yeah. So here's the paragraph. This is the moment of orgasm, I guess. Billy made a noise like a small rusty hinge. He had just emptied his seminal vesicles into Valencia and contributed his share of the green beret, meaning the child they are currently making.
Boy, yeah.
According to the Tralfamadorians, of course, the green beret would have 7 parents in all.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, not very graphic.
No.
Not sexy at all. Right.
I just, the idea of the noise like a small rusty hinge is just like... That's his O face or O noise.
Let's see what else happens here. So yes, she kind of asks him about the war, and that kind of, he gets up to go to the bathroom, and then he's kind of back into the kind of hospital at the war, right? So where he's on
and
morphine.
He has to pee there as well. So he's like. He gets out. He finds his way out of the hospital.
Kind of in the dark.
Yeah, gets snagged on some
barbed wire fence.
A Russian soldier comes by and tries to help him off.
Yeah, and he doesn't even notice the soldier.
No, he's pretty zonked on it.
Yeah,
still probably on morphine. Morphine.
Yeah.
Morphine.
And then he hears all these people kind of crying out in the darkness, and so he kind of maybe is drawn to it or kind of is a little curious, and so he finds kind of the latrines behind the feast hall, and because all these American soldiers that were on the train were so malnourished, they had this crazy feast, this welcome feast, and it really just ripped right through them.
Oh yeah!
So all these soldiers are just like shitting themselves like crazy out in the latrines, just crying out in pain, and Billy kind of scrolls by, and this is where we get the little bit of Vonnegut as the author meeting Billy.
Yeah, he mentions that Billy hears one of the soldiers like yelling how he's shit out everything but his brains.
Yeah, and
then a second later, he's like, "Oh, there they go. There they are. They're gone."
Yeah,
and then he's like, "That was me.
Yeah,
that's the author right there."
There's the little parentheses like that was me as the author. Yeah. We see that the author was present, was kind of part of Billy's world there during the war, and he just somehow accidentally gets himself back to the British hospital area, and then it flashes back to his honeymoon, where they're kind of talking a little bit about their lives, and then he flashes to taking the train to his father's funeral, and he gets woken up on the train because the porter on the train says he's got a crazy hard on.
Yes.
that everyone can see, so he gets woken up and asked to kind of take care of that, and then back in the war hospital, there's another injured guy in there that the English colonel comes in to kind of talk to, and this is where we find out a little bit of kind of the interplay between like the German major who's running the prison and the English colonel. We find out the Americans are going to be shipped to Dresden. They're very much in communication. The German major and the English colonel are kind of like best buds, at this prison. And so Billy gets to overhear some of this information that they're about to be shipped off to Dresden. The Germans have written a propaganda piece about the Americans, that they're poor and undignified and hate themselves, and they're by far the worst prisoners of all. And then we flash back to, which maybe we forgot to open in, we forgot to mention how the book kind of opens in chapter 2 with his daughter reacting poorly to when he actually starts telling them about his time slipping and his abduction and that kind of thing.
Right, because he seems like a lunatic.
Yeah, he's like writing a book or he's written one letter to a newspaper and is writing another letter, kind of laying this stuff out, and his daughter is upset because it's embarrassing the family. And so she's like chastising him, and then we flash into kind of the whole story that we've heard so far. At the end of this chapter, we kind of flash back. And he's now kind of like with his daughter, and she's like, hey, what are we going to do with this guy? He's obviously crazy and doesn't know what the hell's going on. He can't take care of himself.
Also, his furnace isn't on and he hasn't noticed yet. He's
right.
freezing to death.
Like freezing to death, hasn't noticed. So, he gets, I do have the name of the lady.
Yeah, I just found it as well.
Montana Wildhack. Yeah.
A wild hack, sorry.
Yeah. But, so he's, his daughter kind of takes care of him a little bit and helps get the furnace fixed and all that. But basically, they're talking about putting him in a home because he doesn't know what the heck is going on. Just asking. I think the last line of the chapter is, "Father, what are we going to do with you?" And that's the first half and a bit of Slaughterhouse-Five.
Yeah.
So
bringing us to Slaughterhouse Chapter 5.
That's right.
Thoughts so far?
Well, as we mentioned, it's a difficult book to kind of order in your thoughts, right? And I guess you kind of feel for Billy in that sense that if he's always being snapped in and out like of time like that, and that's really happening to him, that it would certainly be difficult to go through life with a very and be very present. Because a lot of times in the scenes where he flashes, forward or back, he's kind of not present, really.
He's almost a passive observer to his own life.
He's observing his own life,
Yeah.
right? So we kind of feel for him in that sense, because reading the book and having to jump around like that, it's difficult to remember where you were, right? And when he snaps back to something, you're kind of like, oh, now I got to try and remember what that was all about and what those soldiers were doing or whatever that is. So, that I think is part of, a way to help us kind of get into Billy's head a little bit. Just how much the book jumps around. We kind of, we start to at least empathize maybe a little bit with Billy in terms of having to live like that.
It's also, I think, the closest that we can get to experiencing time the way that Tralfamadorians do. Mm-hmm. Like this is the closest we can get to seeing all of Billy Pilgrim's experiences at once.
They're coming.
We're still seeing it linearly, but just the way it bounces around is kind of as close as
attempting
we can get.
To be a more of a shock of information.
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting way of showing how things like, the impact of war, the impact of anything, is carried with you forward through time. You never know where it's going to, come up again.
I mean, there's no real description of like PTSD or anything like that in the book, but certainly Billy.
I don't know if PTSD was a known thing. Because this was published in 1969, I think. So,
but Billy is definitely maybe suffering from the war. I mean, obviously that was difficult, but also he's gone through other things, right? Like being abducted by aliens, being naked in a zoo, falling in love with this abducted movie star, who they eventually, have this relationship together.
Living life as an optometrist. I mean, who wants to do that?
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, I hope you don't have any optometrists listening. I'm sure you're living very fulfilled lives.
That's right. Well, and especially if you invest in other, businesses. Billy did very well for himself.
Build an optometry empire if you got to be an optometrist.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely that fractured view and getting all these pieces all coming all at once. I think that it does line up a little bit with, as you were describing the book, or how books are to Tralfamadorians, right? It's just a lot of bursts of information, right? And we certainly kind of get that in this story. So yeah, I'm curious to kind of see where we go from here. I know, I've read this book a long time ago, and I kind of thought I remembered how things went, but reading the first 5 chapters, I'm kind of like, there's snippets where I kind of remember, like, hey, this is familiar, but I can't remember anything. I know.
Yeah.
I know I talked about. I kind of knew what happens in the end, but
now you're not so sure.
I can't recall at all. Reading the first 5 chapters, I'm like, I don't know what happens at all.
Going into this, I don't think I would have been able to tell you anything specific, but like I remember everything as I'm reading it. Like, there's very little, if anything, that's jumped out and surprised me. It's all been like, oh yeah, okay. But like, if I were to tell you what's going to happen in the last half, I mean, we know a few things, right? We know there's a guy who steals a teapot who's going to get executed
by a firing squad.
There's one other death, I think, that gets foreshadowed. And we, of course, know that Dresden's getting firebombed. And it's interesting because he talks in the first chapter about how, in his estimation, maybe this is just generally accepted, that Dresden was sort of a bigger in a way than Hiroshima.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't know the details of it to that extent, but like I feel like I didn't know, I'd never heard of Dresden until I read this book.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you read this book quite some time ago as well, and I read this when I was quite young, whether it was in high school or maybe junior high, and I had never really heard of Dresden, and there hadn't come up certainly in any history class, that obviously Canadians were not maybe as involved in
That's
Dresden,
true.
right? Like, we focus on certain battles where Canadians were more present as far as our war history.
Enough.
But I had never heard of it in that regard. But I mean, the leveling of an entire town through firebombing, and that it was such a a very big cultural center in Germany.
Yeah.
It does not get a lot of talk.
Yeah.
I think in the public sphere. I mean, it doesn't really come up a lot, and but it was a massive loss of life, loss of culture, loss of architecture. Apparently, it was quite like the beautiful city and cultural kind of centerpiece. Lots of kind of music and art and stuff was happening there, and it was like a vibrant kind of large community. It was completely decimated, unlike a lot of other places, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly, at least as far as what I've kind of heard or that gets mentioned in the historical context, doesn't come up a lot. But maybe the fact that it wasn't one bomb, right, keeps it out of the same mention as like,
right, because that's some of the
Hiroshima and stuff
impact
like that.
of Hiroshima is that look at the magnitude from just a single bomb is the thing
right.
there. Yeah.
But I mean, we're talking certainly, I don't know if they say in this book, but it's a large population.
Yeah.
It's a large city. I can't if it's like 60,000 people or something like that, but there's not a ton of survivors of this bombing. Certainly people that were on the outskirts of the city and that kind of thing like that, but there was a huge loss of life and a huge decimation of the city.
Yeah, up to 25,000 people were killed, according to Wikipedia.
Yeah, which is maybe not quite as big, as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but still like wiping out the entire city in one campaign. And I'm not sure. Maybe it'll get talked about later, but I'm not sure what the impetus for that was within the war, as far as focusing on Dresden, because it wasn't a major like military type kind of complex, or the city was not, I think, known for being very militarized.
Yeah.
So it was really potentially more an attack on like art and culture and that kind of thing than anything else. So, but I think we'll find out a little bit more about that later in the book. But it's definitely not a super prevalent thing that's talked about when it comes to World War II.
I guess it was. Dresden was Germany's 7th largest city and the largest remaining unbombed built-up area. So it was like, well, we haven't bombed this yet.
Yeah,
guess we should.
Just by default, let's bomb this. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, without reading the whole Wikipedia article, there's also this bit here where, in his biography of Attlee and Churchill, Leo McKinstry wrote, when Churchill arrived at Yalta on 4th February 1945, the first question that Stalin put to him was, why haven't you bombed Dresden? His inquiry reflected the importance that the Soviet Union attached to an attack on the city following intelligence reports that Germany was moving large numbers of troops towards the Breslau front. Churchill assured Stalin that an Allied attack was imminent. So
it was just because they were moving through there.
I guess.
Wow.
So you have a chance to take out a bunch of troops.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got a bunch to look forward to in the last few chapters. So we've read 5 chapters. I believe there's 5 more,
Okay.
or at least 4 more. So we'll definitely get some conclusion to some of the events that happen as they get moved to Dresden. But we know they're going to be moved to Dresden. Pardon me. We know that the Billy's group is going to get moved to Dresden, the American soldiers. We know there's going to be a firebombing. We know there's going to be an execution, and some other stuff that's going to be happening there.
So it goes.
And so it goes. So yeah, really a book that, when you get halfway through, at least, as we mentioned, like, the sex scene is brief. It's not graphic.
I don't even like calling it a sex scene.
Yeah, barely, right? I mean, even the language is not, maybe I guess it was harsh at the time, but certainly in our day and age, we've seen there's much worse language out there in film and books and things like that. It is kind of
there was
tame.
language on South Park, for God's sakes.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like it's kind of
pick
tame
any episode of South Park, and it's going to be worse than this.
So it's certainly, when you read it, you don't get the impression that it should be banned.
Yeah,
really, like, especially in this day and age, right? When you're talking about challenges in 2009 or 2007 that are still kind of happening around this book, that kind of stuff is tough to justify, because there's nothing in here that is anywhere near the level of profanity or gratuitous sex, violence, drugs, that kind of thing that we see in a lot of other stuff that's out there.
It does make you wonder whether or not on some level, it's the anti-war message that the powers that be are opposed to.
Yeah.
Because war is always going to be, well, we shouldn't say that, but I think
certainly
there's certain people
Yeah.
that will always want war to be an option, and they will always be sending the children off to war. Mm-hmm. So let's not advise children that they shouldn't go to war. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. Yeah. It definitely is a fly in the ointment of the propaganda machine.
Yeah.
And people don't want that.
But it's such a good book, and I am a big fan of the way Vonnegut writes. He's got a very kind of easy, casual, but really precise style.
Yeah, I mean, you're drawn in. I don't want to say against your will, but or obviously we're reading the book because we want to.
Yeah.
But you get drawn in very quickly in terms of how Billy thinks and how he reacts to things happening. Right? We see him as this passive observer of his own life kind of thing, and we get kind of how that affects his decisions, and where he was in the woods and just was saying, "Oh no, just let me die. Like I'm okay." We get a real sense of his character fairly early on, and it's like you're saying, it's casual, but it
almost feels like you're hearing a story around a campfire. It doesn't feel so much like a structured story,
organic,
as much as like he's telling you a story, complete with little asides, complete with like
you're and sitting at a table, this was having drinks, and
and that guy shitting his brains out over there was me, and then blah blah blah, and then 10 years from now this guy dies, so it goes, and it's and that's generally through a lot of his books, his style. And I really appreciate it. So we'll be back in a few weeks with part 2 of our look at Slaughterhouse-Five. And then after that, I'm assuming we'll do a live
we'll do a live episode to kind of wrap it up.
Yep.
And I mean, I think it'll be interesting in the live episode if we have any listeners or people that want to ask questions about kind of there's some interesting thoughts on time.
Yeah.
In this book, right? We've kind of explained a little bit of how other dimensions and time and things are to the Tralfamadorians, but it certainly, I think, begs an interesting question that we've touched on a little bit today around that idea of free will versus everything is written because I can see to the very end of your life or to the end of time or what have you. So how could there be any deviation?
Yeah.
I think, or I'm hoping that maybe we'll have some people that might want to talk a little bit.
I'm
about
more
that.
than happy to talk about that subject.
Right.
I got big thoughts on that.
Yeah. So hopefully we get some people that will want to talk about that live. I think that'd be some interesting discussion.
So, mark your calendars for whenever it's going to be. We don't know yet.
Yeah. We'll keep you updated.
We'll keep you updated.
Yeah.
In the meantime, you can find our website at blahblahblahmedia.com. You can find the podcast there as well as links to everything else, including Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, merch stores, all that good stuff. Am I forgetting anything?
The Facebook page.
Facebook page, and you can email us at bandthingshappen@gmail.com if you have any questions, requests, if you want to swear at us, tell us we're stupid.
Yeah.
And if you listen on iTunes especially, go give us a review. Reviews are super helpful.
Yes.
Not every podcast platform offers reviews, but I know iPhone or iTunes does. Or Apple Podcasts. I don't know what it's called anymore.
I think Apple Podcasts.
I think it's Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, something like that.
Google Podcasts is shutting down.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that's sad.
Yeah, because that was my podcast platform. They're moving everything to YouTube, which I don't know. I'm going to have to find. I think I'm going to start listening to podcasts on Podbean.
Yeah.
And then I'll support the app that publishes our own podcast.
I do use the Apple one. Again, don't even know what it's called.
Yeah.
Just because it's there already. It comes pre-installed, on your phone. So unfortunately, I defaulted into that when I first started listening to podcasts. But reviews are super helpful. And questions and notes and comments and things like that as well, right?
Yeah.
We definitely are interested in any feedback.
And especially if you think any of these books should have been banned. That's the whole point of this conversation is, where are we drawing those lines? Especially when it comes to adults, consuming books on their own. I think, most people agree that they should be welcome to, but a lot of times it comes down to what's being allowed in schools, what's being taught in schools. Yeah. And that's where the conversation is about, where the line should be drawn. Because I would say, nobody in the third grade needs to read this.
It might be a bit of a challenge in the third grade.
Bit of a challenge.
But yeah.
I mean, if you had
I know for myself, like I read this when I was pretty young.
Yeah.
Like I said, I can't remember if it was early high school or maybe even earlier, kind of junior high type things. But
I could see this being covered in schools, or at least in school libraries, because this is, like I said, again, it's a very kind of casual, easy to approach language. It's not too long. It's just a little over 200 pages, so it's not daunting for someone, and it does a pretty efficient job of quickly showing how fucking dreadful war can be.
Yeah.
And not in the grand hundreds and thousands of people died way, just in the mundane people dying alone in the mud. Well,
it's
gangrene because they had bad
individual
shoes.
Yeah, it's a very individual experience, right? And I think that helps bring it home as something that people can relate to. Right? Because when you hear that, thousands of people died in a bombing or that is sad.
It's too big a number to really.
It's tough to relate to and empathize with on a personal level. Yeah, for sure.
But Roland Weary dying of gangrene because he had bad shoes and his feet were like bloody stumps.
Yeah,
that you can see, you can comprehend it.
And he wants revenge.
He wants revenge.
Billy Pilgrim.
Will he get revenge from beyond the grave? Find out next time on When Bad Things Happen to Good People. I've been Todd Sullivan.
I've been Peter Ammon.
And until we meet again,
go read a fucking book.